Chapter 12 of The City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End, Chapter 12, Crisis. 3 men of Earth stared at the big Capellan, and for a long, long moment no one spoke. Gore Hall became absorbed in the glass he held between his hands. Magro watched them with his bright cat eyes. The beautiful streaming light poured over them, and the men were like 3 images of stone. Bertram Garris found his tongue at last, but it was only to repeat Gore Hall's words, as Kenaston had translated them. "Evacuation?" he said, and again, "Evacuation?" "To the world of another star," said Kenaston slowly. His mouth twitched, and he leaned close to Gore Hall and cried, "What do you think we're made of?" Gore Hall looked around their faces, and then said ruefully, "I guess I've talked too much." His ruefulness was no more convincing than his earlier surprise. Mayor Garris had begun to tremble. A fury was building up in him, a genuine fury that had nothing to do with display. He glared at Magro and Gore Hall. "They knew this all along, that woman and the others," he said. "They came in here, pretending to be our friends, and all the time, behind our backs—" He stopped. His wrath and fear were all but choking him, coming so swiftly after joy. His voice went up an octave. "You tell them, Kenaston, tell them from me, if they think we're going to move clear off the Earth to some... He stammered over the sheer impossibility of what he was saying. "Some damn fool place out in the sky, well, they're crazy." Hubble said to Kenaston, "Ask him if this is a thing they do, these governors. I mean, this moving of whole populations from one world to another." Gore Hall nodded to that. "Oh yes, whenever life on some planet becomes economically unsound, or the margin of survival is too small, the governors evacuate the people to a better world. There are lots of them, good, warm, fertile planets that are uninhabited, or nearly so. They did it to some of my own people, moved them from Capella 5 to Aldebaran." Kenaston cried out of his anger, "And people let that be done to them? They didn't even resist it?" Gore Hall said, "People, human people, I mean, have got millions of years of civilization behind them. They're used to peaceful government, used to obedience, and they've been moving from world to world ever since they left Earth ages ago, so that one planet doesn't mean much more than another to them. But the primitive humanoid folk, lately civilized, like my own and Magro's, aren't so reasonable. There's been a good bit of resentment among them about this evacuation business. In fact, they hate it, just as much as you do." "Here," said Hubble sharply. "Where are you going?" He was talking to the mayor, who was striding suddenly toward the door. He caught Garris by the coat and pulled him back. The mayor struggled sullenly to free himself. "I'm going to tell them," he said, jerking his head toward the sounds of revelry that came from the crowd of Middletowners in the plaza. "Move off the Earth? They'll have something to say about that." "What do you want to do?" snapped Hubble. "Start a riot? Don't be a fool. That's no way to handle this. No, it's that ice-water blonde we've got to talk to, and that fellow Lund." He shook Garris. "Stop it, I say. Going off half-cocked will only make it harder for everyone." Garris stopped struggling. He looked from Hubble to Kenaston and back again. "All right," he said. "We'll talk to them. But they'd better get it through their heads that they're not dealing with any flock of tame sheep." He stamped back into the room. "Ordering us off our own world. Get those 2 freaks out of here, Kenaston. I was right the first time. They're not to be trusted. They're—" "Oh, shut up," said Kenaston impatiently. "Gore and Magro don't make the laws. They're simply being decent enough to give us fair warning of something we wouldn't have known about until it was too late." He knew there was more in it than that, but he was too hurried and upset to search for deeper motives now. He turned to Gore and the Spican. "Listen," he said. "You've seen how the mayor reacted. Well, I can assure you that all our people will react just that way, only more so. Tell that to Varn Allen, and tell her that she better come here and talk about this evacuation before she gets in too deep. Tell her we don't like having things done behind our backs. Tell her—" He caught himself, surprised by his own fury. "No, I guess you couldn't tell her that," he said, and Gore Hall grinned. "As one primitive to another, I get your meaning." "Well, all right. And Gore, you and Magro and the others better stay out of the city. When this thing breaks, I wouldn't guarantee anybody's safety." "Oh," said Gore Hall, and grinned very widely, so that even his grinders glistened. "We'll be quite safe, confined to quarters in the ship. We, or rather I, have done an evil thing. We have spoken out of turn and upset the policy." The three of them, humanoids and human, looked at each other, and there was understanding between them. Kenaston put his hand on Gore Hall's furry shoulder, and gripped the iron muscles of it, and Magro said, "One more thing, Kenaston. If there's trouble, and I seem to smell trouble very strongly in the air, watch out for Lund. Varn Allen may be much too sure of herself, but she's honest. Lund, well, he wants Varn's job, and he will cheerfully cut anyone's throat to get it." "That is so," said Gore Hall. "Remember, Kenaston." "I'll remember, and thanks." They went away to take the message of defiance to the ship. Kenaston watched them go, and the mayor watched them, and they listened to the cheering that followed them all the way to the portal. "I'm sorry I called them freaks," the mayor said suddenly. "By God, they're more like us than the people in that ship." Hubble nodded. "Their culture level is closer to ours. They haven't lost their old aboriginal roots. Our own people have gone too far beyond us. The whole pattern of their thinking is different. We're strangers now to our own kind." To Kenaston, the cheering and the happiness of the Middletowners out there was an ironically bitter thing now, if they knew what was being planned for them. He said to Hubble, nodding his head toward the mayor, "Will you stick with him and keep him from telling everyone? He'll listen to you more than to anyone." Hubble said, "I will. You get some sleep, Ken. You've been working a tough grind, and the Allen woman and Lund won't likely come before morning." And Kenaston slept, but neither much nor well. In spite of his exhaustion, Gore Hall's words rang like passing bells in his mind all the rest of that night. Evacuate, evacuate, to the world of another star. And he thought of all the people of Middletown who happily believed their troubles were over, and of Carol. Particularly of Carol, and most of all, he thought of Varn Allen, whom he had begun to hate, and he was afraid. It did not take much imagination to divine what the mayor's narrowness had missed: a vast and powerful machinery of government directing this future universe, a machinery of which the big starship and its occupants were but a symbol. It did not seem likely that a handful of people on a dying planet could successfully defy that government for very long. Hubble woke him at last out of an uneasy slumber to tell him that Varn Allen and Lund had come, and that the mayor had called the city council. "We need you to interpret, Ken," he said. "You speak the language better than any of us, and this is too important to take any chances of misunderstanding." Neither of them talked very much on the way to the soaring tower that was now City Hall, and Kenaston could see that Hubble was as worried and oppressed as he. A crowd had gathered in the plaza, a happy crowd, come to cheer their good friends who had helped them so much, Inside City Hall, the Council of Middletown sat around a massive metal table. The mayor, Borchard the coal dealer, Moretti the wholesale produce merchant, half a dozen more, facing at one end of the table the woman and the man who came from Vega and who were administrators over a vast sector of space with all its worlds and peoples. Mayor Garris fastened on Kenaston the moment he came in. He looked as though he had slept even less than Kenaston, and his mood had not changed since the night before. "You ask her, Kenaston," he said. "You ask her if this evacuation story is true." He asked her. Varn Allen nodded. "Quite true. I'm sorry that Gore Hall spoke so prematurely. It seems to have upset your people." She glanced at the ominous faces of the city council and the tense countenance of the mayor. It struck Kenaston that she had been all through this situation before with other populations, and was attacking the problem with a kind of weary patience. "I am sure," she said, "that when they understand, they will realize that we are only serving their best interests." "Best interests?" cried Garris, when he had heard that. "Then why didn't you tell us at first? Why plan this behind our backs?" Norden Lund, a smug look on his face, said to the woman, "I told you it would have been better." "We'll discuss that later," she flashed. Kenaston could see the effort she made to keep her imperious temper in check as she went on, speaking directly to him. "We wanted to wait until we could present a complete plan of evacuation, so as not to upset your people too much." "In other words," said Kenaston angrily, "you were dealing with a bunch of primitive aborigines who had to be coaxed along?" "Aren't you acting in just such a fashion?" Varn Allen demanded. Again, she visibly got a grip on her irritation. She said, carefully, as though explaining to a child, "A ship full of evacuation experts is on its way here, should arrive soon. They can assess the needs of your people and find a world that will fit their physical and psychological needs. We will see that it is a world as much like your past Earth as possible." "That," said Kenaston ironically, "is very decent of you." The woman's blue eyes flashed open hostility at him. He turned away from her, for Garris was demanding a translation. He gave it, and in his own resentment he did not soften it. Garris forgot oratory in his indignation. He sputtered, "If they think we're going to move away from Earth to some crazy world out in the sky, they're badly mistaken. You make that clear to them." Varn Allen looked honestly bewildered when Kenaston did. "But surely you people don't want to stay in the cold and hardship of this dying world?" Kenaston, watching the anger and the instinctive, basic fear grow still stronger in the mayor's white face, could understand his feelings. His own reaction was the same. "Not want to stay here?" said Garris, forcing words out painfully from a throat constricted with emotion. "Not want to? Listen, you people. We have left our own time. We have had to leave our own city, our homes. That's enough. It's all we can stand in one lifetime. Leave Earth? Leave our own world? No!" There was no oratory about him now at all. He was like a man who has been asked to die. Kenaston spoke to Varn Allen. His own voice was not quite steady. "Try to understand. We are Earth-born. Our whole life, all the generations before us, since the beginning." He could not put it into words, this sudden passionate oneness with Earth. "The Earth hath he given to the children of men. The Earth, the soil, the winds and the rains, the growth and the dying over the ages, beast and tree and man. You could not forget that. You could not let drop the heritage of a world as though it had never been." The sorrel-haired Norden Lund was speaking to Varn Allen, looking contemptuously at the Middletowners as he spoke. "I warned you, Varn, that these primitives are too emotional for ordinary methods." The woman, her blue eyes troubled, ignored Lund and addressed Kenaston. "You must make them recognize the facts. Life here is impossible, and therefore they must go." "Let her tell that to the people," said the mayor, in an oddly tight voice. "No, I'll tell them myself." He rose and left the council room. There was a curious dignity about his plump figure now. Borchard and Moretti and the others followed. They, too, showed a shrinking, instinctive dread of the thing that had been proposed. They went out on the steps, and Kenaston and Hubbell and the two from the Stars went with them. Outside in the plaza were still gathered thousands of the Middletowners, mill hand, housewife, banker and bookkeeper, the old men and the little children. They were still happy, and they cheered, sending up a great joyous shout to echo from the towers. Mayor Garris took the microphone of the loudspeaker system. "Folks, listen carefully. These new people are telling us now that we ought to leave Earth. They say they'll give us a better world, somewhere out there among the stars. What about it? Do you want to go, away from Earth?" There was a long moment of utter silence, in which Kenaston saw the Middletowners' faces grow bewildered, incredulous. He looked at Van Allen's clear-cut face and saw that the shadow of weariness on it was deeper. He realized again that two epochs, two utterly different ways of life, were looking at each other here, and finding it difficult to understand each other. When, finally, the crowd of Middletowners had grasped the suggestion, their answer came as a rising chorus of exclamations. "Go off and live someplace in the sky? Are these people nuts? It was bad enough to leave Middletown for this place, but to leave Earth—" A large-handed, stocky man, whom Kenaston recognized as Lauber, McLean's truck driver, came to the steps and spoke up to the mayor. "What's all this about, anyway? We're getting along here all right now. Why would we want to go off to the moon or somewhere?" The mayor turned to the two starfolk. "You see, my people wouldn't listen to an idea like that for a minute." Kenaston told the woman, "The people completely reject the whole proposal." Varn Allen stared at him in honest surprise. "But it is not a proposal. It is a formal order of the Board of Governors. I recommended this evacuation, and they have approved it." Kenaston said dryly, "Unfortunately, our people don't recognize any authority but their own government, so the order means nothing to them." The woman looked appalled. "But nobody defies the governors. They are the executive body of the whole Federation of Stars." The Federation of Stars? It had a sound of distant thunder in it. And again Kenaston realized the incomprehensible, staggering vastness of the civilization out there which this woman and this man represented. He said, exasperated, "Can't you understand that to these people the stars are just points of light in the sky? That your suns and worlds and governors mean nothing to them?" Norden Lund chose that moment to intervene. He said smoothly to Varn Allen, "Perhaps in an impasse of this nature we should consult Government Center?" She gave him a hot look. "You would like me to admit my incapacity by doing that? No. I'll carry this matter through, and when it's done, I'll have words to say to Gore Hall for precipitating things prematurely." She turned to Kenaston and said, "Your people must comprehend that this is not a cruel thing we're doing. Explain to them what life would be like on this dead planet, isolated, precarious, increasingly difficult, with nothing to look forward to but an ultimate dying out of attrition and sheer hopelessness. Perhaps they'll realize then that what they're asking me to do is to abandon them to a very ugly fate." "Perhaps," said Kenaston, "but I wouldn't count on it. You don't know us yet. As a people, we're neither soft nor easily frightened." He spoke with hostility, because of the truth that he had recognized in Varn Allen's words, and did not want to recognize. She gave him a level glance, as though she were taking his measure, and through him the measure of all Middletown. Then she said quietly, "Bear in mind that a formal decree passed by the Board of Governors is a law which must be respected and complied with. The evacuation has been ordered and will be carried out." She nodded to Lund, who shrugged and fell in beside her. They went down the steps and across the plaza, and the muttering crowd, alarmed and confused but not yet hostile, moved apart to let them through. Kenaston turned to Hubbell. "What are we going to do?" he said, and the older man shook his head. "I don't know. But I know one thing we must not do, and that is to let any violence occur. That would be fatal. We've got to calm people down before that evacuation staff arrives and brings things to a head." Kenaston did his best during the rest of that day. He repeated Varn Allen's plea for understanding, but it fell on unreceptive ears. The city was functioning. They had light and water. They were not alone in the universe, and life today seemed pretty good. With the irrepressible optimism of the human race, they were convinced that they could make tomorrow even better, and they were not going to leave Earth. That was like asking them to leave their bodies. The shock of losing their own time and the pattern of life that went with it had been terrible enough. It might have overwhelmed them completely, Kenaston knew, except that in a measure the shock had been softened. For a while they had kept their own old city, and it was still there beyond the ridge, an anchor in their memories. To a certain extent they had brought their own time with them, for life in the alien city had been adapted as much as possible to the pattern of life in old Middletown. They had oriented themselves again. They had built a facsimile of their familiar existence. It had been hard, but they had done it. They could not now, quite suddenly, throw it all away and start again on something utterly divorced from everything they had ever known. Kenaston realized perfectly that it was not only an atavistic clinging to the earth that had bred them which made them reject the idea of leaving it so fiercely. It was the physical and immediate horror of entering a perfectly unknown kind of ship and plunging in it out beyond the sky into what? Night and nothingness and sickening abysses that ran on forever, with only the cold stars for beacons, and the earth, the solid, understandable, protecting earth, lost forever. His own mind recoiled from the very imagining. Why couldn't the woman understand? Why couldn't she realize that a people to whom the automobile was still quite recent were not psychologically capable of rushing into space? The great ship brooded on the plain, and all that afternoon and evening the people drifted restlessly toward the wall of the dome to look at it, and stand in little groups talking angrily, and move away again. The streets seethed with a half-heard murmur of voices and movement. Crowds gathered in the plaza, and a detachment of National Guardsmen in full kit went marching down to mount guard at the portal. Dejected, oppressed, and more than a little sick with worry, Kenaston faced the unavoidable and went to Carol. She knew, of course. Everybody in New Middletown knew. She met with him with the drawn, half-bitter look that had come more and more often on her face since the June day their world had ended, and she said, "They can't do it, can they? They can't make us go." "They think they're doing the right thing," he said. "It's a question of making them understand they're wrong." She began to laugh, quite softly, laughter with no mirth in it. "There isn't any end to it," she said. "First we had to leave Middletown, now we have to leave Earth. Why didn't we stay in our homes and die there if we had to, like decent human beings? It's all been madness ever since. This city, and now She stopped laughing. She looked at him and said calmly, "I won't go, Ken." "You're not the only one who feels that way," Kenaston told her. "We've got to convince them of that." Restlessness rode him, and he got up and said, "Let's take a walk. We'd both feel better." She went out with him into the dusk. The lights were on, the lovely radiance that they had greeted with such joy. They walked, saying very little, burdened with their own thoughts, and Kenaston was conscious again of the barrier that seemed always between them now, even when they agreed. Their silence was not the silence of understanding, but the silence which is between two minds that can communicate only with words. They drifted toward the section of the dome through which the distant starship was visible. The unease in the city had grown until the air quivered with it. There was a mob around the portal. They did not go close to it. Through the curved, transparent wall the lighted bulk of the Thanos was no more than a distorted gleaming. Carol shivered and turned away. "I don't want to look at it," she said. "Let's go back." "Wait," said Kenaston. "There's Hubble." The older man caught sight of him and swore. "I've been hunting the hell and gone over town for you," he said. "Ken, that bloody fool Garris has blown his top completely, and is getting the people all stirred up to fight. You've got to come with me and help soothe him down." Kenaston said bitterly, "No wonder Varn Allen thinks we're a bunch of primitives. Oh, all right, I'll come. We'll walk you back home on the way, Carol." They started back through the streets, whose towers now shone timelessly beautiful in the calm white radiance. But the people in those streets, the little tense talking groups, the worried faces and questions, the angry expletives, jarred against that supernal calm. The pulse of unease in the city seemed to quicken. A low cry ran along the streets. People were calling something. A shout was running along the ways, hands pointed upward, white faces turned and looked at the shimmer of the great dome above. "What—" Hubble began impatiently, but Kenaston silenced him. "Listen." They listened. Above the swell of distant voices, growing louder every moment, they heard a sound that they had heard only once before. A vibration, more than a sound, a deep bass humming from the sky, too deep to be smothered even by the dome. It came downward, and it was louder and louder, and then, quite suddenly, it stopped. People were running now toward the portal, and the words they shouted came drifting confusedly back. "Another starship," said Kenaston. "Another starship has come." Hubble's face was gray and haggard. "The evacuation staff. She said they'd arrive soon. And the whole town ready to blow off. Ken, this is it." End of Chapter 12. Of the City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 13. Embattled City. With a sinking heart, Kenaston stared at Hubble and listened to the sharpening voice of the city. Carol spoke, and the words reached him from a long way off. "Never mind me, Ken. I'll get home all right." "Yes," he said. "I'm afraid we've got to get hold of the mayor right away. Stay in off the streets, Carol." He kissed her swiftly on the cheek, and she turned away, walking fast. Kenaston hesitated, feeling that he ought to go with her, but Hubble had already started on, and there was no time for punctilio. After all, there was no danger, not yet. He caught up with Hubble. People streamed past them, going the other way toward the portal. Frightened, belligerent people, their eyes a little too bright, their voices too loud. Kenaston and Hubble were almost running, but even so, it took them some minutes to reach the plaza in front of City Hall. As they crossed it, jeeps loaded with National Guardsmen pulled away from the government building and went tearing off down the boulevard. The men were wrapped to the eyes in heavy clothing, and Hubble groaned. "They're going outside. Now what the devil has that idiot done?" They raced up the steps and into the building. In the council chamber they found the mayor with Borchard and Moretti and most of the councilmen. Garris strode up and down, his face mottled, his eyes glittering with the courage born of fear. He turned to Kenaston and Hubble as they came in, and there was a curious blankness in his look, an absence of reason that made Kenaston lose what little hope he had. "So they're going to try to rush us away from Earth," said Garris. "Well, we'll see. We'll see how far they're going to get with that." His voice shook, his pudgy hands were clenched. "I've called up all units of the National Guard, and did you see those jeeps? They're on their way to Old Middletown to bring the field guns from the armory. Guns, Hubble, guns! That's the only way to show 'em they can't order us around." "You fool," said Hubble. "Oh, you fool." It was too late in the day to call the mayor a fool, and Hubble found it out. Borchard snarled at him. "He's acting with our complete approval. Listen, Mr. Hubble, you stick to your science, and we'll handle the government." "That's right," said Moretti. He said it 2 or 3 times, and the remaining council members backed him up. Hubble faced him. "Listen to me," he said. "You're all scared so blind you can't see what's in front of you. Guns! All the guns we've got won't make a pop like a toy pistol compared to what they can bring against us if they want to. These people have conquered the stars. Can't you understand that? They can conquer us with no more than that ray they've got on the ship, and violence would only anger them into doing it." Garris thrust his face close to Hubble's. "You're afraid of them," he said. "Well, we're not. We'll fight." The council cheered. "All right," said Hubble. "Go ahead. There's no use arguing with idiots. The only chance we had of beating this thing was to behave like civilized men. They might have listened to us then, and respected our feelings. But now—" He made a gesture of negation, and the mayor snorted. "Talk. A lot of good your talking did. No, sir. We'll handle this our way, and you can be thankful that your mayor and council haven't forgotten how to defend the rights of the people." His voice rose almost to a shout to carry the last words to Hubble, who had walked out with Kenaston close on his heels. Outside in the plaza, Kenaston said abruptly, "There's only one thing to do. Talk to Varn Allen. If she'd agree to call off her dogs for a while, things might simmer down." He shook his head, making a wry face. "I hate to admit to that blonde bureaucrat that we're governed by a bunch of half-witted children, but—" "You can't really blame them," said Hubble. "We are like children, faced with the unknown, and since we can't run and hide, we have to fight. It's just that they're taking the wrong way." He sighed. "You go out to the ship, Ken. Do what you can. I'm going back in and struggle with His Honor. If I'm patient enough—oh, well, good luck." He went back inside, and Kenaston retraced his weary steps toward the portal. The crowd had doubled since he had last seen it. It pushed and swirled around the portal, spreading out on both sides along the wall of the dome. Out on the plain the lights of 2 ships gleamed, and the people watched them, a low murmur running through them like the first mutter of wind before a storm. The company of guardsmen in full kit had taken up their station in the portal, a barrier of olive drab picked out with the dull gleam of gun barrels. Kenaston went up to them. He nodded to some of the men he knew and said, "I'm going out to the ships. Important conference," and started through the line. And they stopped him. "Mayor's orders," the lieutenant said. "Nobody goes outside. Yeah, I know who you are, Mr. Kenaston, but I have my orders. Nobody goes outside." "Listen," said Kenaston, desperately manufacturing a lie. "The mayor sent me. I'm on his business." "Bring me a written order," said the lieutenant, and we'll talk about it some more." The line of guns and stolid men remained unmoved. Kenaston considered trying to crash it, and gave that up at once. The lieutenant was watching him suspiciously, so suspiciously that an uncomfortable thought occurred to Kenaston. He spoke the language, and he had worked closely with the Star folk, and the good people of Middletown might just possibly take him for a traitor or a spy. "If the mayor sent you," the lieutenant said, "he'll give you an order." Kenaston went away, back to the city hall, and he spent the rest of the night cooling his heels with Hubbell, outside the guarded door behind which the mayor, the council, and the ranking officers of the National Guard were drawing up a plan of campaign. Shortly after daybreak, an orderly came in hastily, and was admitted to the guarded room. Immediately the mayor, the council, and the officers came out. Garris, haggard, heavy-eyed, but triumphant, caught sight of Kenaston and said, "Come along, we'll need you to interpret." Feeling old and hopeless, Kenaston rose and joined the little procession. Falling in beside him, Hubbell leaned over and murmured, "Talk fast, Ken. Your knowledge of the language is our one last ace in the hole." They reached the portal at almost the same time as the party from the starships. Varn Allen and Lund were the only ones in the group that Kenaston recognized. Of the others, one was a woman of mature years, and the remainder were men of varying ages. They stared, more in wonder than in apprehension, at the line of soldiers. Varn Allen frowned. The mayor marched up to her, as the line reformed to let him and his party through. A soiled, haggard little man, devoutly convinced of his own wisdom, and secure in the knowledge that his people were with him. His courage screwed up to the last trembling notch, he faced the strangers from the stars, and said to Kenaston, "Tell them this is our world, and we give the orders here. Tell them to get into their ships and go. Inform them that this is an ultimatum which we are prepared to enforce." The crowd behind him roared approval. A faint uneasiness had appeared in the faces of the Starfolk. That mob yell, the armed soldiers, and the attitude of the mayor must have roused a doubt in them. And yet Varn Allen spoke quite calmly to Kenaston, hardly waiting for the mayor to finish. "Will you please have way made for us?" She indicated the newcomers who were with her. "These officials had a large staff of experts on mass migration. They will begin preliminary planning of the evacuation, and it is important that you cooperate." Kenaston interrupted her. "Listen," he said. "You take your officials and get back to your ships." The crowd was beginning to move forward a little, pressing up against the line of soldiers. Individual shouts came out of it, ugly, threatening counterpoint to the growling undertone. The mayor shifted nervously from one foot to the other. "Did you tell her?" he demanded. "What's she saying? Did you tell her?" Kenaston cried out, "Go back to your ships, and quickly! Can't you see that mob's about to break loose?" But still Varn Allen did not seem to understand. "There's no room for further argument," she said, as though her patience was at an end. "We are here on direct orders from the Board of Governors, and I must ask you to—" Speaking very distinctly, Kenaston said, "I am trying to prevent violence. Go back to your ships now, and I'll come out and talk to you later." She stared at him in utter astonishment. "Violence?" she said. And again, "Violence? Against officials of the Federation?" It crossed his mind that that was something she had never seen nor heard of. In the momentary silence between them, the surge and rumble of the crowd grew louder, and abruptly Norden Lund laughed. "I told you that you were taking the wrong way to deal with savages," he said. "We'd better go." "No." Secure in her pride, in the authority vested in her by the Federation of Stars, in her proven ability as an administrator, Varn Allen was not going to run before the shouts of a mob. She turned on Kenaston, her voice perfectly steady and sharp as a steel knife. "I don't think you understand," she said. "When an order is issued in the name of the Board of Governors, that order is obeyed. You will so inform your mayor, and require him to disperse his people, and at once." Kenaston clenched his fists and groaned. "For Christ's sake," he began, and then the mayor, the over-anxious, bellicose, and frightened mayor, set the spark to the ready tinder. "You tell 'em they'd better get out in a hurry," he cried, loud enough to be heard clearly by the front ranks of the crowd. "Tell 'em to get out, or we'll run 'em out." "Run 'em out!" yelled a man, and another, and 100 others. "Run 'em out!" The crowd roar rose to a howl. The press of men and women surged forward through the portal, and if they had wanted to, the soldiers could not have held them back. Kenaston caught a kaleidoscopic glimpse of faces: the middle-aged woman official with her mouth open in a scream, the incredulous eyes of the men that did not credit what they saw, Varn Allen's cheeks flaming a sudden angry red, Lund already backing away, a study in mingled fear and triumph. Varn Allen said, "If you dare to touch Federation officials—" "Get back to your ships!" yelled Kenaston. "Get back!" The first wave of the mob was upon them, all shouts and fists and trampling feet. They were howling for Varn Allen because she was the leader. Kenaston saw the danger. He grabbed her wrist and began to run toward the Thanos, hauling her along. The other officials, including Lund, had taken to their heels. It was amazing how they could run. He dragged Varn Allen along, and for some seconds she did not resist. He realized later that it must have been the first physical violence she had ever encountered, and that she was too astonished by it to think of resisting at first. Then, all at once, she cried out passionately, "Let me go!" and set her heels hard into the dust. The crowd was boiling after them, and it was no time for niceties. Kenaston gave her wrist a jerk that snatched her off balance and began to run again, yanking her bodily along. And then, as the Thanos loomed fairly close ahead, he missed his footing in the loose sand and stumbled, and she wrenched herself free from him. During the moment that he floundered in the treacherous sand, Kenaston saw the first pallid beam flick out from the ship. It swung in a wide arc, bringing a sudden uproar from the crowd. And then it hit him, and this time the shock was strong. He dropped forward into the sand and lay there like a dead man, utterly still and knowing nothing. He came back to consciousness, lying flat on his face in a bunk with Gore Hall's powerful fingers kneading the nerve centers along his spine. He groaned, and the Capellan exclaimed in relief, "Thank the gods you've come round. I've been working on you the last couple of hours." Kenaston sat up painfully. He saw in a small, windowless cabin, furnished with a desk and a chair designed to accommodate Gore Hall's huge proportions, and it dawned on him that he must be inside the Thanos. "How did I get here?" he asked. It was difficult to speak. His tongue, like the rest of him, was numb and leaden. "Varn Allen had brought you in. She realized afterward that you were trying to haul her out of trouble, and knocking you out was a mistake. She wanted you fixed up as quickly as possible." Kenaston was too groggy to be sarcastic. He groaned again and mumbled, "What's happened, Gore?" "Plenty, and all of it bad. Look here." He touched a stud, and a square section of the metal wall became perfectly transparent, a window. Kenaston struggled to his feet and looked out through it, at the distant, gleaming dome of New Middletown. And he saw the men of Middletown laboring in the ochre dust before the portal, digging trenches, filling sandbags, drawing up the lines of war. Gore Hall pointed out across the dreary waste toward the far-off ridges. Kenaston looked, and saw the brave small cavalcade that toiled down from them out of the old town. He saw the shrouded field guns, the whole mobile force of the Middletown battery of the National Guard, the little guns that came to bark defiance to the Federation of Stars. Gore Hall said, "They gave us 3 hours to pack up our traps and go, long enough to get their battery in position. After that, they'll start shooting." "The fools," Kenaston whispered. "The poor bloody fools." He could have wept with pride, in spite of his full realization of the extent of that folly. The time was almost up. Those hurrying limbers would reach the portal and swing around, and soon then the men of Middletown would cast the die of their own destruction. "I've got to stop this, Gore," he said. "Somehow I've got to stop it." Gore Hall studied him with a curiously intent, measuring look. He said, "How much are you willing to risk on a try? No, wait before you answer. It won't be easy. Especially for you, with your background, it won't be easy." "Get to the point," said Kenaston. He grasped almost fiercely at the hint of hope. "Come on, what is it?" Gore Hall said, "There are other dying planets beside your Earth, and, as I told you, we primitives cling to the worlds of our birth just as your people do. There has been well, call it a conspiracy, between the primitive races to stop mass migration, and our whole plans center on the process Lalore told you about, John Arnold's process of reviving dead worlds, which has been forbidden by the Federation. Kenaston, we could make Earth a test case." "In other words," said Kenaston slowly, "you want to involve me and my people in a movement to help your peoples buck the Federation law?" "Quite frankly, yes. But it's to your benefit, too. If you win, you'll have Earth, and we'll have our own worlds to stay on. If you lose, well, you'll be no worse off than you are now." He put his great paw on Kenaston's shoulder. "Listen to me. Varn Allen is on the televisor now, getting authorization from Vega Center to use force in carrying out her orders. Think fast, Kenaston." Kenaston thought. It was like moving blindfold through an unfamiliar maze, but he could make sense of the outlines, the undercurrents of disaffection that flowed between the stars. He had no right to involve himself and Middletown in a struggle that he knew almost nothing about. But there, beyond the window, were the trenches filled with angry men, and the dusty limbers wheeling down, and how could they be worse off than they were now? If there was even an outside chance— "What do I have to do?" he asked. Gore Hall grinned. "Good," he said. "And remember, you'll have allies in this thing. Now, come on with me, and I'll tell you on the way." End of Chapter 13. Of the City at World's End, by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 14. Last Appeal. The big Capellan led him out then swiftly through a maze of narrow passageways that ran through the bowels of the Thanos. They met no one, and Kenaston guessed that Gore Hall was avoiding the main corridors. He hardly looked at what he could see of the ship as he passed through it. He didn't care now. All he could think of was the terrible need for haste, the need to avert the disaster that was coming. His ears, his nerves cringed, waiting for the first shell to burst against the Thanos. He knew it was too soon, but the minutes were passing fast. Gore Hall did some rapid explaining as they went. "The evacuation order came from the Board of Governors by an executive committee. According to Federation law, you can make an appeal from that order to the Board of Governors in full session. Now, remember, Kenaston, no one can deny you the right of appeal, so don't let them bull you out of it." They came out on a shadowy catwalk. Gore Hall stopped and pointed to a corridor some 9 feet below. At its end was a closed door. "That's the visor room. Varn Allen is in contact with the committee now. Go in and make your appeal. And remember, Lund is in there too." He melted back into the shadows. Kenaston went down a companionway to the corridor and along it to the door at the end. He tried it, and it swung open under his hand, and he went through into a high and narrow room, where Varn and Norden Lund turned to face him, startled and surprised by his sudden entrance. He hardly saw them. Something else caught his gaze and held him transfixed, frozen with a kind of awe. 2 walls of the room were occupied by complicated and unfamiliar mechanisms, all apparently automatic. Facing him was the 3rd wall, a giant-sized screen, reproducing so clear a picture that it was weirdly like a window into another world. At a black plastic table sat 4 figures. 3 of these were men in ordinary jackets and slacks, one of them quite old, another elderly, the third dark, brusque-looking, not far into middle age. The 4th at the table was not a man. He was a Spican like Magro, white-furred and oddly cat-like, with his narrow mane and handsome, faintly cruel face. But he was older and graver than Magro. The 4 of them were like a quartet of businessmen, rudely interrupted in the midst of an earnest conference. They stared out of the screen at Kenaston, and the youngest man demanded of Varn Allen, "Who is this person?" Kenaston still stood motionless, looking beyond them now. He saw that the room behind them was like the one in which he stood, but much larger, a communications room massive with control banks and screens. Through the window of that room, billions of miles across space, Kenaston could see the looming wall of a titanic building. And above it blazed the fiery limb of a diamond sun, supernal, magnificent, shedding a blue-white blaze across the heavens. Again the sharp voice from across the galaxy, flashing through the parsecs far faster than light by the magic of latter-day science. "Varn Allen, who is this man?" "He's one of the Earth primitives, sir," she answered angrily, and turned again to Kenaston. "You have no right here. Leave at once." "No," said Kenaston. "Not until I've had my say." "Lund," said Varn Allen, "will you please call orderlies and have him removed?" Kenaston moved a little. "I wouldn't," he said. Lund considered. His eyes moved from Kenaston's knotted fist to Varn Allen's angry face, and there was a smile in them. "After all," he said, "I suppose this man is a citizen of the Federation now. Can we deny him his right of speech?" Varn Allen's blue eyes flashed hotly at him. Then she spoke to the images in the screen. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but perhaps this will demonstrate the situation here more clearly. I have had no cooperation from the primitives, and my own subordinate is apparently trying to undermine my authority." The dark younger man of the 4 said impatiently, "This is not the occasion to hear complaints of administrative wrangling." Kenaston was glaring upward at the quartet on Vega's faraway world, who seemed to hold the fate of Middletown in their hands. He demanded, "Are you the executive committee responsible for the evacuation order?" The oldest man said to him quietly, "There is no need for truculence. Yes, we are that committee." He glanced at Varn Allen. "I think, Allen, that since the interruption has been made, we may as well clear this thing up now." Varn Allen shrugged, and Lund's smile broadened a little. Kenaston said, "I'm sorry, but there isn't time for politeness. In a few minutes, my people are going to fire on your ships. I don't want that to happen. I don't want my people killed, nor yours." The old man answered, "There will be no killing. The paralysis ray, used at full potency, can immobilize your whole population without harm." Kenaston shook his head. "That's only a postponement. When they come to again, they will fight. That is what I must make you understand. As long as my people live, they will fight to stay on Earth." The ring of utter truth in his passionate cry seemed to disturb them deeply, and the white-furred Spiken said slowly, "It may be so. Some of my own people still have such an illogical attachment to one planet." Lund spoke up, his tone smooth and deferential. "That is the point of basic psychology which I have been trying to make with Administrator Allen." Varn Allen said icily, "If you have a suggestion to make, I shall be glad to hear it." "Of course," said Lund. "It's quite impossible to allow these people to remain on Earth. To do so would establish a fatal precedent for other waning planets, whose populations must be transferred. But my idea—" Whatever Lund had been going to say was lost, for Kenaston drowned him out. "The hell with your ideas!" He moved closer to the screen. "I ask you to revoke the order for evacuation." The old man spread his hands in a weary gesture of negation. "That is out of the question." "Then," said Kenaston harshly, "I appeal your decision to the Board of Governors in full session." That startled them all. They stared at him, and Lund said, "So, the savage has learned a little law." Then he laughed. "But, of course, Gore Hall and his friends have been coaching him." Varn Allen came up to Kenaston. "This is a waste of time," she said. "The Board of Governors will issue the same ruling." "Quite so," said the dark, brusque man in the screen. "It's merely a stratagem to gain time." "Nevertheless," said the Spiken, regarding Kenaston with faint amusement in his split-pupiled eyes, "his demand is perfectly legal." The old man sighed. "Yes." He looked at Kenaston. "I am forced by Federation law to grant you a right of appeal. But I warn you that Administrator Allen is right. The Board will ratify our decision." "Until they do," Kenaston pressed, "I demand that you withdraw from Earth the ships that have created this critical situation." The old man nodded reluctantly. "That, too, is a legitimate demand. The ships will be recalled temporarily to Vega, and you will come with them, since all appeals to the Board of Governors must be made in person." In person? The significance of the two casual words hit Kenaston staggeringly, replacing his dawning hope with a breathless and more personal emotion. Those two words meant—they meant leaving Earth. He, John Kenaston, going out into the dark abyss, out across half the starry universe on a forlorn hope, out to an incredibly distant and alien world, to plead the cause of Middletown to alien ears, with all the odds against him. He knew now what Gore Hall had meant. "With your background, it won't be easy." Varn Allen's crisp voice was challenging him. "Do you agree to go? Say quickly. There's little time left to notify your people before they attack." Mention of that imminent attack that meant irrevocable disaster to his people steadied Kenaston. He had to avert that, at any cost or risk. He drew a long breath. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I'll go." "In that case, Administrator Allen," said the old man, "you will take your ships off in not more than 2 hours." He rose, signing that the interview was closed. "I shall notify the Board of Governors." The screen went blank. Varn Allen looked at Kenaston and said, "You had better go and tell your people at once." He knew, as he went out, that she was very angry. But Lund seemed strangely pleased. With what speed he could muster, Kenaston went back across the desert toward the portal, and with every step he took, the incredible reality of his commitment beat into his mind. "You're going away from Earth. You're going to get into a ship, that ship, and step clear off the Earth, out to the stars." Just the realization of it gave him a feeling of vertigo, a shuddering recoil, and he knew that he had to keep his mind away from what it would be like in that ship, in space. He had to avoid anticipation, or the impact of it would be too much for him. Soldiers met him well outside the portal, raising their rifles but lowering them again when they recognized him. Beyond them, the red dust was flying from laboring shovels, and the gun limbers were being wrestled into place. "What's going on out there?" cried a sergeant. "Are those ships going to attack? Where's the mayor?" Kenaston interrupted. "Back inside the portal. They're all there, waiting." Kenaston pushed past them, between the half-dug trenches, and saw Hubble and most of the council grouped around Mayor Garris just inside the dome. Most of Middletown's people seemed crowded in the background, held back by rope barriers. They weren't shouting now. Their faces looked anxious, and he knew that that demonstration of the paralysis ray's power had cooled down their rage and given them something to worry about. Garris' plump face was haggard with strain, too, and he greeted Kenaston with a suspicious scowl. "What brought you back? I thought you'd stay out there with your friends." Kenaston's temper, tightened by the weight of the thing he was going to do, let go. "For Christ's sake," he snarled, "I've been fighting to save your necks. I've even agreed to go out to Vega to do it, and this is the kind of reception I get?" Then he was ashamed of his outburst and got a grip on his nerves. "Listen to me. Those ships are leaving. They're leaving inside of 2 hours, and I'm going with them. I'm appealing this whole evacuation question to their board of governors." A wondering silence fell upon them all. They stared at him, all their faces, except Hubble's, uncomprehending. Hubble exclaimed, "Good God, Ken! You to Vega? But will it do any good?" "I'm hoping so," Kenaston said. He ignored the others, speaking to Hubble as he rapidly explained. "So there's a chance that I can make them understand our case and let us alone." Mayor Garris had only now begun to understand, apparently. His face had changed. There was an eager hopefulness in it now, a hopefulness dawning also on the faces of Borchard and Moretti and the others. Kenaston realized then just how hopeless they had all been before his coming. They, and the soldiers, and the people of Middletown, were still ready to fight evacuation, but the futility of such a fight had been made clear to them by the power of the ray. They had known they must fight a battle foredoomed to failure, and now he had brought them a hope at least of another way out. "Well now," said Garris, a little unsteadily, "that's the way I've wanted it all along. Due course of law, peaceful debate. It was just that I couldn't let them force our people—" He broke off, seizing Kenaston's hand. "You'll do your best for us out there, Kenaston. I know that. They can't be all as stubborn as that blasted woman." And, almost unmanned by his relief, Garris turned and cried out to the anxious crowd, "It's all right, folks. There's not going to be any fighting right now. Mr. Kenaston's going to go clear out to where those people come from and put this thing to their government. He's going to ask a square deal for us." There was cheering, during which the mayor's high color began to fade back to its original pallor as a new thought struck him. He said to Kenaston, "But if anyone's going out there to represent us, maybe as mayor—" Kenaston really admired him as he struggled to get out those last awful words. "As mayor, I ought to go?" Kenaston shook his head. "You're needed right here, Mr. Garris. And besides, you don't speak the language, so there wouldn't be any use in your going." "That's so," said the mayor, beginning to breathe again. "Of course, that's so. Yes, indeed. Now, Kenaston, what can we do to help you? Anything—" "No, there's nothing," said Kenaston. I haven't much time. I only need to get a few things and to say goodbye to someone. Hubble, will you come with me?" Hubble came. And behind them, as they hurried back into town, they heard the mayor shouting, and heard the rising voice of relief and jubilation from the people. They had seen themselves about to be beaten in a hopeless fight against weapons they couldn't combat, those people, and now, suddenly, there wasn't going to be any fight. The ships were going away. One of their own was going out and convinced the Starfolk that they couldn't shove Earth people around. Everything was going to be all right. Kenaston groaned. "I wish they weren't so goddamned sure. This is only a reprieve." "What are our chances, Ken?" Hubble asked him. "Between us." "Honest to God, Hubble, I don't know. I've got us into a big, undercover struggle that I don't half understand yet." He told Hubble what Gore Hall had said, and added, "Gore and the humanoids are on our side, and maybe they're only using me as a cat's paw. Anyway, I'll do my best." "I know you will," said Hubble. "I wish I were going with you. But I'm too old, and I'm needed here." He added, "I'll get Carol while you pack." The nightmare unreality of it hit Kenaston again as he hastily got his few necessaries together. It was just like packing for an overnight run to Pittsburgh or Chicago, instead of for a trip across the galaxy. It couldn't be really going to happen. Carol's face, when she came, didn't help him. There was no color in it at all, and when he took her in his arms and tried to explain, she only whispered, "No, Ken, no. You can't go. You're not like them. You'll die out there." "I won't die, and I can maybe help us all," he told her. "Carol, listen. If I can do this, if I can find a way out for us, it'll make up a little for our work that brought this whole thing on Middletown, won't it? Won't it?" She wasn't even listening to him. She was searching his face, her hands clinging to him painfully, and she said suddenly, "You want to go." "Want to?" said Kenaston. "I'm scared stiff. My skin is crawling right now. But I've got to." "You want to go," she said again, and looked at him. He thought, as though he finally saw clearly a barrier between them. "That's the difference between us. It's always been the difference. I only want the old things, the old loved ways. You want the new." Time was running out, and a sort of despair was in him, and it made him grasp her with a rough male masterfulness, and hold her fiercely against the intangible tide that was sweeping them apart. "I'm going to do what I can for us all, and I'm coming back the same, and you're going to be waiting for me, Carol, you hear?" He kissed her, and she returned his kiss with a curious tenderness, as if she were never going to see him again, and was remembering all the good days that they had had together. And when he let her go, her eyes were bright with tears. He went with Hubble toward the portal, and now the whole city was vibrant with a new hopefulness and excitement that centered upon himself. But he was quaking with the realization of what he was going toward. He hardly saw the crowded faces that watched him with a mixture of anxious hope and of awe. He hardly heard the voices that shouted, "Good luck, Mr. Kenaston!" and "You tell 'em out there, Mr. Kenaston! You tell 'em!" Kenaston went on, out of the domed city and across the plain, and the black, strange belly of the Thanos took him in. End of Chapter 14. Of the City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 15. Mission for Earth. He would not show fear. They expected him to do so. They were watching him with sidelong glances of interest and amused expectation. But Kenaston clenched his fists inside his jacket pockets and resolved fiercely to disappoint them. He was afraid, yes. It was one thing to read and talk and speculate on flying space. It was another and much more frightening thing to do it, to step off the solid earth, to rush and plunge and fall through the worldless emptiness. He stood there with Gore Hall and Piers Eglin, in the bridge of the Thanos, looking ahead through the curving view windows, and a cold sickness clutched at his vitals. "It isn't the way I expected it to be," he said unsteadily. "Only those stars ahead." He fought against the impulse to clutch for support. He wouldn't do that, while the bronzed starmen behind him were curiously watching him. The deep humming and slight quivering of the great fabric around him were the only evidence that the Thanos was moving. Directly ahead, Kenaston looked at a depthless black in which fierce stars flared like lamps. The blue-hot beacon of Vega centered that vista, and up from it blazed the stars of the time-distorted Lyre and Aquila, a cross on the upper left by the glittering sun-drift of the Milky Way. Only that section of sky ahead was clear. The rest of the firmament, extending back from it, was an increasingly blurred vista of warped starlight, whose rays seemed to twitch, jerk, and dance. Gore Hall nodded toward the bank of controls behind which 4 men sat. "You know the principle of propulsion? Reaction rays many times faster than light, pushing back against the cosmic dust of space." Kenaston sighed. "I feel ignorant as a child. The possibility of such rays was wholly unsuspected in my day. And Einstein's equations prove that if matter moved faster than light, it would expand indefinitely." Gore Hall uttered a rumbling chuckle. "Your Einstein was a great scientist, but we've opened up new fields of knowledge since then. The mass control that prevents that expansion, and other things." Kenaston was only half listening. He was looking at the blue-white eye of Vega, glaring arrogantly at him from the great drift of spangled stars. And looking at it somehow made him sense their awful speed, their nightmare fall through the infinite. It was worse than the takeoff, and he had not thought that anything could be worse than that. If he lived forever, he would never forget those last still minutes, strapped into a recoil chair, trying to relax and not succeeding, listening to ringing alarm bells, watching the blinking of lights, feeling the deep quivering of the ship as it gathered itself for the outward leap, his heartbeats choking him and the icy sweat running, trying to tell himself that it was no different from taking off in a plane. And then the lift, the pressure, the instinctive gasp for breath, the terrible claustrophobia of being shut into a moving thing over which he had no control. He could not know yet by what mastery of science the occupants of the ship were shielded from the enormous pressures of that acceleration. Yet shielded they were, for the pressure was not so much worse than that in a fast-ascending elevator. It was the knowledge that Earth was falling irretrievably away that made the lift horrible. He could hear the whisper and the hiss and then the scream of air against the cleaving hull, and then almost at once it was gone. He was in space. And he was sick with the age-old fear of abysses and of falling. He thought of the emptiness that lay beneath his feet, beyond that thin floor of metal, and he shut his teeth hard on his tongue to keep from screaming. "Don't think about it," Gore Hall had said. "And remember, there's a first time for all of us. I thought I wouldn't live through my own first takeoff." He had helped Kenaston get to his feet. "Let's go up on the bridge. You might as well get it all over with at once." And so they had come to the bridge, and Kenaston had looked into outer space where the great suns burned unveiled, and there was neither air nor cloud to hide them. And he had to get hold of himself, because he was too proud to do what he wanted to do, which was to get down on his belly and whimper like a dog. He tried now to visualize the ordeal that awaited him there at Vega, where he must plead the cause of Little Middletown to the governors of the stars. How could he make people who traveled casually in ships like this one understand the passionate devotion of his own people to their little, ancient planet? Yet If he failed to do so, he would fail the people of Middletown, who had such hope in his mission. That was what he had to think about, not space, nor his sensations about it, but the task he had ahead of him. He glanced at Gore Hall and said, "I've seen enough. Let's go." They left Piers Eglin there and went below again, and when they were in the main corridor alone, Kenaston said, "All right, Gore. I want to know what I've got myself in on." The big Capellan nodded. "Let's join Magro and Lalor. They're waiting for us." He led Kenaston along companionways and narrow corridors, to a cabin only 2 doors from his own. And it was a relief for Kenaston to be in a closed place without windows, so that he need not look at the staggering, crushing emptiness of space, where only the proud suns had any right to be. There was a wild thrill to it underneath the fear, but a 20th century man couldn't take much of it at first. Lalor's massive gray form was bent over a table littered with sheets of complicated symbols. Magro, who was sprawled in the bunk, explained to Kenaston, "He works theorems for amusement. He even claims he knows what all those figures mean." Lalor's small eyes twinkled in his flat, featureless face. He thrust the sheets aside and said, "Sit down, Kenaston. So, we are to be allies now, as well as friends." "I wish," said Kenaston, "that someone would tell me just what this alliance means. Remember, I'm gambling the fate of my people on faith, without knowing a damn thing." "There's nothing sinister about it," said Gore Hall. He eased his furry bulk onto the corner of Lalor's table, which was quite strong enough to hold him. "As I told you, we all have the same problem, and the solution to that problem revolves around a man and a process." He paused. "By a peculiar freak, Kenaston, you have been thrown with us rather than with your own kind. The human races spread out from Earth so long ago, and have continued to move and spread, constantly expanding, that they have lost all sense of identification with their old birth world, or any other. The universe is their home, not a planet." Kenaston was beginning to understand that better with every passing minute. The impersonal magnitudes of space, many times recrossed, would tend to sever a man from the old narrow ways of thought. Carroll had been right about that. Gore Hall went on, "But we of the humanoid races don't have that background. When the humans came to our worlds, we were nearly all barbarians, and quite happy in our barbarism. Well, they civilized us, and now we are accepted as equals. But we're still more primitive in thought than they. We still cling to our native worlds, and whenever it becomes necessary to move us, we balk, just as your people are balking now, though we have learned to be less violent. In the end, of course, we've always given in. But in the last few years, we've hung on more desperately because we've had something to hope for. This process of John Arnall's." "Hold on," said Kenaston. "All I know of John Arnall is his name. What exactly is this process? You said it was a process for the rejuvenation of cold and dying planets?" Lalor answered that. "Arnall's plan is this: to start a cycle of matter-energy transformation similar to the hydrogen-helium transformation which gives a sun its energy. To start such a nuclear cycle operating deep inside a cold planet." Kenaston stared at him, completely stunned. "But," he said at last, "that would be equivalent to creating a giant solar furnace deep inside a planet." "Yes, a bold and brilliant idea. It would solve the problem of the many cold and dying worlds within the Federation, since, as you know, a planet may live on its interior heat long after the parent sun's heat has decreased." He paused. "Unfortunately, when Arnold tested his process on a small asteroid, the results were disastrous." "Disastrous?" "Quite disastrous. Arnold's energy bomb, designed to start the cycle inside that asteroid, went wrong and caused terrible quakes. In fact, the asteroid was wrecked. Arnold claims that it was because he was not allowed a large enough planet for his test. His equations bear him out." Kenaston said, "Why didn't he make another test on a bigger planet, then?" "The governors would not allow it," said Lalor. "They said it was too dangerous." "But couldn't he have tested it on an uninhabited planet without danger?" Lalor sighed. "You don't understand, Kenaston. The governors don't want Arnold's process to succeed. They don't want to make it possible for primitive peoples to cling to their native worlds. That's the kind of provincial patriotism they oppose, in their efforts to establish a truly cosmopolitan star community." Kenaston thought about that. It fitted what he had seen and heard of this vast federation of stars. And yet, he said slowly, "It comes down to the fact that you want to use my world, our Earth, to test a scheme which your governors, whatever their motives, have already ruled as dangerous." Lalor nodded calmly. "Yes, it comes down to that. But whether the test is made first on Earth or some abandoned planet is beside the point. The point is to force the Board of Governors to allow another test." Gor-Hol exclaimed, "Don't you see how it links up? Alone, your plea to remain on Earth will be turned down because you can't present any alternative to evacuation. But by advancing John Arnold's planet reviving process as an alternative, you might be able to help both Earth and us." Kenaston struggled to comprehend the galactic complexity of the problem. "In other words, if we could persuade the governors to give Arnold another chance, they would delay the evacuation of Earth?" "They would," said Lalor. "And if Arnold succeeded, Earth and our similar worlds throughout the Federation could be made warm and livable again. Is it not worth trying for?" "When you put it like that," said Kenaston, "yes, it is." He was beginning to be hopeful again. "And do you think this solar furnace thing might succeed? Safely, I mean?" "According to all mathematical evidence, yes." Still, Kenaston hesitated, and Gor-Hol said, "The decision would be up to your people, Kenaston, and not you. Whether they take the risk, I mean. And remember, it's a small population and could be taken off quite easily until any danger was over." That was true. He need not be afraid of committing his people too deeply, because he had not the power to do that. And it might be a way. "Is it agreed, then?" asked Lalor. "Arnold has been my friend for many years, and I can message ahead to him to be there when we land. He can help you prepare your plea." Kenaston looked at them, the three familiar, unhuman faces. He had to trust them, to take what they said on trust. Suddenly, he knew he did trust them. "All right," said Kenaston. "I guess any hope is better than none." "Then we are agreed," said Lalor quietly. Kenaston felt a little breathless, as though he had taken an irrevocable plunge into deeps far beyond his own fathoming. Gor-Hol shot a keen glance at him and said, "You need something, and I think I know what it is." He went out and returned in a moment with a large flat flask of gray metal. He showed his great teeth in that frightening grin. "Fortunately, not being ship's personnel, we of the technical staff are not forbidden stimulants. Get some cups, Magro." The white-furred Spican brought only 3 of the plastic cups. "Our wise Lalor prefers to stimulate himself with equations," he explained, and the gray one nodded. Gor-Hol carefully poured a clear liquid from the flask. "Try this, Kenaston." The liquid had a musty, mushroomy taste. Then it seemed to explode inside Kenaston, sending waves of heat to his fingertips. When he could breathe again, he gasped, "What is this stuff?" Gorhol said, "It's distilled from fungus growths found on the worlds of Capella. Smooth, eh?" Kenaston, as he drank again, felt his worries recede a little. He sat relaxed and listening as these children of alien worlds talked. He knew they were talking now just to let down his tension. "First voyages can be tough," Magro was saying. He was curled up on the bunk like a sleepy cat, with a distant, lazy gleam in his eyes. "I remember my own. We shot the Pleiades with half our power burned out, and the little world swarming around us like angry bees." Gorhal nodded. "Do you remember that wreck in the Algol Stardrift? I lost good friends then. A cold grave, those empty deeps." Kenaston listened as they talked on, of old voyages beyond the Federation's starry frontiers, of dangers from nebula and comet and cosmic cloud, of shipwreck on wild worlds. He quoted slowly, "Then shall we list to no shallow gossip of Magellans and Drakes. Then shall we give ear to voyagers who have circumnavigated the ecliptic, who have rounded the polar star as Cape Horn." Lalore asked interestedly, "Who wrote that? Some man of your own time who foresaw space travel?" "No," said Kenaston. "A man of a century before even my time. His name was Melville, and he was a sailor too, but on Earth's seas." Gorhal shook his head. "Queer days they must have been, with only the water oceans of one little planet to venture on." "Yet there was adventure enough in that," Kenaston said. "The Atlantic in a fall storm, the Gulf on a moonlit night—" An aching nostalgia took him again, that haunting homesickness for an Earth lost forever, for the smell of leaves burning on crisp fall nights, for a clover field under the summer sun, for the blue skies and green hills, the snowy mountains and the sleepy villages and the old cities and the roads that went between them, for all that was gone and could never be again. It made him long even for the Earth that still was, the tired, dying old planet that at least held memory of the world he had known, the people there who had known that world too. Carol was right. The old ways and the old things were best. What was he doing out here in these alien immensities? Then he saw that the others were looking at him with a queerly sympathetic understanding in their faces, those strange and yet familiar and friendly humanoid faces. "Give me another drink," he said. It did not help any. It only seemed to heighten his futile yearning. Presently Kenaston left them and went to his own cabin. He switched off the cabin lights and pressed the stud that made a window of the solid hull. The black, star-shot gulf opened to infinity beyond. He sat on the edge of the bunk and stared, hating that uncaring, unhuman vastness, brooding upon his desperate mission. Presently he realized that someone was knocking at his door. He rose and opened it, and the light in the corridor showed him that it was Varn Allen. End of Chapter 15. Of the City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 11. Revelation. The crew of the Thanos came into New Middletown that afternoon, and Kenaston and Carol and all the rest of the city's thousands watched them come. There were 200 of them. A hard-handed, alert, capable breed, no different from all the sailors Kenaston had ever seen, though their seas were the incalculable deeps of outer space and their faces were darkened by the rays of alien suns. Across the blowing dust of this world that had bred and lost them, they came, and with them were the others Piers Eglin had spoken of, the strange children of other stars. Kenaston had explained about these aliens to Carol, who had seen no more than the tips of Gore Hall's furry ears, and had supposed, like the others, that he was only a peculiar kind of pet. He didn't think that she had really understood him, any more than the people of New Middletown had really understood the mayor's similar explanation. "From Vega," Carol had said, and shivered, looking toward the dim sky where the stars showed even in daylight. "They can't be like us, Ken. No human being could ever go out there and still be like us." Kenaston was startled to hear his own thoughts repeated in her voice, but he said reassuringly, "They can't have changed too much. And the others, the humanoids, they may look queer, but they're our friends." It was what Mayor Garris had told his people. "Whatever these newcomers are like, they've got to be treated right, and there's a jail cell waiting for anyone who makes trouble with them. Do you all get that? No matter what they look like, act as though they're people." Hearing is one thing, seeing another. And now Carol's fingers closed tight on Kenaston's hand, and her body shrank against his, and the crowd who had gathered to watch this second entrance of the incredible into their midst stared and whispered and moved uneasily. One of these aliens was big and bulky, walking stodgily on massive legs. His wrinkled gray skin hung in heavy folds. His face was broad and flat and featureless, with little, wise old eyes that glanced with shrewd understanding at the staring, silent crowd. Two were lean and dark, moving like conspirators wrapped in black cloaks. Their narrow heads were hairless, and their glance was bright and full of madcap humor. Kenaston realized with a shock that the cloaks they wore were wings, folded close around their bodies. There was another, who had peculiar gliding grace that hinted of unguessed strength and speed, and whose bearing was very cool and proud. He was handsome, with a mane of snow-white fur sweeping back from his brow, and there was only a faint touch of cruelty in his broad cheekbones and straight, smiling mouth. These four, and Gore Hall, were manlike, but not men, children of far worlds walking with easy confidence on old Earth. "They're horrible," whispered Carol, drawing away. "Unholy. How can you stand to be near them?" Kenaston was fighting down much the same reaction. The Middletowners gaped and muttered, and drew back, partly from a creeping fear of the unnatural, partly from sheer racial resentment. It was hard enough to accept the fact that such non-human people existed at all. It was harder still to accept them as equals. Beast was beast, and man was man, and there was no middle ground. But not to Middletown's children. They ignored the bronzed spacemen and clustered in droves around the humanoids. They had none of their elders' preconceptions. These were creatures out of fairy tales come alive, and the children loved them. Piers Eglin came up to Kenaston. Kenaston said, "Hubble has the main generator rooms opened up. He's waiting for us there. I'll take you." Eglin sighed. "Thank you," he said. He seemed desperately unhappy. Kenaston said a hasty goodbye to Carol and fell in beside the little historian. "What's wrong?" he said. "My orders," said Piers Eglin. "I am to interpret, and to teach some of you our language." He shook his head dismally. "It will take days, and that old city of yours, I should be in it every moment." Kenaston smiled. "I'll try to learn fast," he said. He led the way to where Hubble was waiting by the generators, and behind him he heard the eerie footfalls of the creatures who were not human, and it was incredible to him that he was going to have to work beside these weird beings who gave him a cold shiver every time he came near them. Surely they could not behave like men. They went into the building, into an enormous room filled with the towering, dusty shapes of armored mechanisms that he and Hubble had not been able to make head or tail of. The senior scientist joined them, looking askance at the humanoids. Kenaston said. "We supposed that these were the main generators." He spoke to Peer Eglin, since Eglin must do the translating, but he was facing Gore Hall and the 4 others who stood beside him. "If they can really repair and start them, we—" His voice trailed off. The 5 pairs of alien eyes regarded him, the 5 alien bodies breathed and stirred, and the crest of white fur on the Proud One's skull lifted in a way so beast-like that it was impossible for Kenaston to pretend any longer to accept them as human. Doubt, distrust, and just a hint of fear crept into his face. Piers Eglin frowned a little and started to speak. With the suddenness of a bat darting out in the evening, one of the lean dark brothers whipped wide his wings and made a little spring at Kenaston, uttering a cry that sounded very much like "Boo!" Kenaston leaped backward, startled almost out of his skin, and the lean one promptly doubled up with laughter, which was echoed by the others. Even the large gray creature smiled. They all looked at Kenaston and laughed, and presently Hubble got it and began to laugh too, and after that there was nothing for Kenaston to do but join in. The joke was on him at that. They had known perfectly well how he felt about them, and the lean one had paid him back in his own coin, but with humor and not malice. And somehow, after they had laughed together, the tension was gone. Laughter is a human sort of thing. Kenaston mumbled something, and Gore Hall slapped his shoulder, nearly putting him on his face. But when he approached the dusty generators, Gore Hall changed abruptly from a shambling, good-natured creature into a highly efficient technician. He operated hidden catches, and had a shield panel off one of the big mechanisms before Kenaston saw how he did it. He drew a flat pocket flash from a pouch on his harness, and used it for light as he poked his hairy, bullet-shaped head inside the machine. His low, rumbling comments came out of the bowels of the generator. Finally, Gore Hall withdrew his head from the machine and spoke disgustedly. Eglin translated. "He says this old installation is badly designed and in poor condition. He says he would like to get his hands on the technician who would do a job like this." Kenaston laughed again. The big, furry Capellan sounded like a blood brother to every repair technician on old Earth. While Gore Hall examined the other generators, Piers Eglin fastened onto Hubble and Kenaston, deluging them with questions about their own remote time. They managed at last to ask a question of their own, one that was big in their minds, but that they'd had no chance to ask before. Why is Earth lifeless now? What happened to all its people? Piers Eglin said, "Long ago, Earth's people went out to other worlds. Not so much to the other planets of this system. The outer ones were cold, and watery Venus had too small a land surface. But to the worlds of other stars across the galaxy." "But surely some of them would have stayed on Earth," said Kenaston. Eglin shrugged. "They did, until it grew so cold that even in these domed cities life was difficult. Then the last of them went to the worlds of warmer suns." Kenaston said, "In our day, we hadn't even reached the moon." He felt a little dazed by it all. To the worlds of other stars across the galaxy. Gore Hall finally came back to them and rumbled lengthily. Eglin translated. "He thinks they can get the generators going, but it'll take time, and he'll need materials. Copper, magnesium, some platinum." They listened carefully, and Hubble nodded and said, "We can get all those for you in Old Middletown." "The Old City?" cried Piers Eglin eagerly. "I will go with you. Let us start at once." The little historian was afire for a look at the old town. He fidgeted until he and Hubble and Kenaston, in a jeep, were driving across the cold ochre wasteland. "I shall see with my own eyes a town of the pre-atomic age," he exulted. It was strange to come upon old Middletown, standing so silent in the midst of desolation. The houses were as he had last seen them, the doors locked, the empty porch swings rocking in the cold wind. The streets were drifted thick with dust. The trees were bare, and the last small blade of grass had died. Kenaston saw that Hubbell's eyes were misted, and his own heart contracted with a terrible pang of longing. He wished that he had not come. But in that other city, absorbed in the effort to survive, one could almost forget that there had been a life before. He drove the jeep through these deathly streets, and memory spoke to him strongly of lost summers, girls in bright frocks, catalpa trees heavy with blossom, the quarreling of wrens, and the lights and sounds of human voices in the drowsy evening. Piers Eglin was speechless with joy, lost in a historian's dream as he walked the streets and looked into shops and houses. "It must be preserved," Eglin whispered. "It's too precious. I will have them build a dome and seal it all, the signs, the artifacts, the beautiful scraps of paper." Hubbell said abruptly, "There's someone here ahead of us." Kenaston saw the small bullet-shaped car that stood outside the old lab. Out of the building came Norden Lund and Varn Allen. She spoke to Eglin, and he translated. "They have been gathering data for her report to Government Center." Kenaston saw the distaste in the woman's clear-cut face as her blue eyes rested on the panorama of grimy mills, the towering stacks black with forgotten smokes, the rustling rails of the sidings, the drab little houses huddled along the narrow streets. He resented it, and said defiantly, "Ask her what she thinks of our little city." Eglin did, and Varn Allen answered incisively. The little historian looked uneasy when Kenaston asked him to interpret. "Varn Allen says that it is unbelievable people could live in a place so pitiful and sordid." Lund laughed. Kenaston flushed hot, and for a moment he detested this woman for her cool, imperious superiority. She looked at old Middletown as one might look at an unclean ape's den. Hubbell saw his face and laid a hand on his arm. "Come on, Ken. We have work to do." He followed the older man into the lab, Piers Eglin trailing along. He said, "Why the hell would they put a haughty blonde in authority?" Hubbell said, "Presumably because she's competent to fill the job. Don't tell me old-fashioned masculine vanity is bothering you." Piers Eglin had understood what they were saying, for he chuckled. "That's not such an old-fashioned feeling. Norden Lund doesn't much like being sub for a girl." When they came out of the building with the materials Gore Hall had requested, Varn Allen and Lund were gone. They found, upon their return to New Middletown, that Gore Hall and his crew were already at work disassembling the generators. Bellowing orders, thundering deep-chested Capellan profanity, attacking each generator as though it were a personal enemy, Gore Hall drove his hard-handed spacemen into performing miracles of effort. Kenaston, in the days that followed, forgot all sense of strangeness in the intense technical interest of the work. Laboring as he could, eating and sleeping with these star-worlders through the long days and nights, he began to pick up the language with amazing speed. Piers Eglin was eager to help him, and after Kenaston discovered that the basic structure of the tongue was that of his own English, things went more easily. He discovered one day that he was working beside the humanoids as naturally as though he had always done it. It no longer seemed strange that Magro, the handsome, white-furred Spiken, was an electronics expert whose easy, unerring work left Kenaston staring. The brothers, Ban and Bal, were masters at refitting. Kenaston envied their deftness with outworn parts, the swift ease with which their wiry bodies flitted bat-like among the upper levels of the towering machines, where it was hard for men to go. And La Lore, the old gray stodgy one of the massive body, who spoke little but saw much from wise little eyes, had an amazing mathematical genius. Kenaston discovered it when Lalor went with him and Hubble and Piers Eglin to look at the big heat shaft that seemed to go down to the bowels of the earth. The historian nodded comprehendingly as he looked at the great shaft and its conduits. It descended, he said, to the earth's inmost core. It was great work. It, and others like it, in these domed cities, kept Earth habitable ages longer than would otherwise have been the case. But there is no more heat in Earth's core to tap now. He sighed. The doom of all planets, sooner or later. Even after their sun has waned, they can live while their interior heat keeps them warm. But when that interior planetary heat dies, the planet must be abandoned. Lalor spoke in his throaty, husky voice. But John Arnall, as you know, claims that a dead cold planet can be revived, and his equations seem unassailable. And the bulk gray Myron, for that star had bred him, Kenaston had learned, repeated a staggering series of equations that Kenaston could not even begin to follow. Piers Eglin, for some reason, looked oddly uncomfortable. He seemed to avoid Lalor's gaze as he said hastily, John Arnall is an enthusiast, a fanatic theorist. You know what happened when he tried a test. As soon as Kenaston could make himself understood in the new tongue, Piers Eglin considered that his duty was done, and he departed for Old Middletown, to shiver and freeze and root joyfully among the archaic treasures that abounded in every block. Left alone with the Starworlders, Kenaston found himself more and more forgetting differences of time and culture and race as he worked with them to force life back into the veins of the city. They had New Middletown's water system in full operation again, and the luxury of opening one of the curious taps and seeing water gush forth in endless quantities was a wonderful thing. Many of the great atomic generators were functioning now, including a tremendous auxiliary heating system which made the air inside the dome several degrees warmer. And Gore Hall and Magro had been working hard on the last miracle of all. There came a night when the big Capellan called Kenaston into one of the main generator rooms. Magro and a number of the crewmen were there, smeared with dust and grease, but grinning the happy grins of men who had just seen the last of a hard job. Gore Hall pointed to a window. "Stand over there," he said to Kenaston, "and watch." Kenaston looked out over the dark city. There was no moon, and the towers were cloaked in shadow, the black canyons of the streets below them pricked here and there with the feeble glints of candles and the few electric bulbs that shone around the city hall. Gore Hall strode across the room behind him, to a huge control panel half the height of the wall. He grunted. There was a click and a snap as the master switch went home, and suddenly, over that nighted city under the dome, there burst a brilliant flood of light. The shadowy towers lit to a soaring glow. The streets became rivers of white radiance, soft and clear, and above it all there was a new night sky, the wondrous luminescence of the dome, like a vast bowl fashioned out of moonbeams and many-colored clouds, crowning the gleaming towers with a glory of its own. It was so strange and beautiful, after the long darkness and the shadows, that Kenaston stood without moving, looking at the miracle of light, and was aware only later that there were tears in his eyes. The sleeping city woke. The people poured out into the shining streets, and the sound of their voices rose and became one long shout of joy. Kenaston turned to Gore Hall and Magro and the others. He wanted to say something, but he could not find any words. Finally he laughed, and they laughed with him, and they went out together into the streets. Mayor Garris met them almost at once, having run all the way from City Hall. Hubble was with him, and most of the men from the old lab, and a crowd of Middletowners. There was no making any sense out of anything that was said, but the people hoisted Gorhal and Magro and the crewmen to their shoulders and rode them in a triumphal procession around the plaza, and the shouts and cheers were deafening. More than water, more than heat, the people treasured this gift of light, and on that night they accepted the humanoids as brothers. A little later, a breathless and jubilant group gathered in City Hall, Gorhal and Magro, Kenaston, Hubble, and the mayor. Bertram Garris wrung the big Capellan's mighty paw and beamed at Magro, trying to express his thanks for all that they and the others had done, and Gorhal listened, grinning. "What's he saying?" he asked Kenaston, who now occupied the position of interpreter. Kenaston laughed. "He wants to know what he can do to show his appreciation, like giving you the city, or his daughter in marriage, or a few pints of his blood. Seriously, Gor, we are all mighty grateful. You people have made the city live again. And, well, is there anything we can do to show you we mean it?" Gorhal considered. He looked at Magro, and Magro nodded solemnly. Gorhal said, "Well, being primitives, we could use a drink." Hubble, who had picked up a smattering of the language, began to laugh. Kenaston translated for the mayor, who immediately proclaimed a medical emergency and hastened to produce bottles from the hoard. It was a cheerful celebration, and Kenaston found himself actively missing Bal and Ban and the grey Lalor, who had returned to the ship with part of the crew a day or so before. An unhappy thought occurred to him, and he said, "I suppose you people will be going away pretty soon, now that the work's done." Magro shrugged his supple shoulders. "That will depend on a number of things." He glanced lazily at Gorhal. Gorhal was a little drunk by now, not much, but loud and cheerful. The mayor was feeling good too, and was affectionately patting the Capellan's great furry shoulder. "I want you to understand," Garris was saying earnestly, "that I'm sorry about that stupid bull of mine when I first saw you. We're all sorry, seeing how much you've done for us." "Listen, we haven't done much," said Gorhal when Kenaston had translated. "But the lights and all will make you more comfortable here while you're waiting." Kenaston stared at him. "What do you mean, while we're waiting?" "Why, while you're waiting to be evacuated, of course," said Gor. There was a little silence. Kenaston felt a queer tension seize him, and he knew suddenly that this was something he'd been unconsciously expecting, something that he'd felt wasn't quite right all along. He said carefully, "Gor, we don't understand this. What is this talk of evacuation?" The big Capellan stared at him, with surprise in his large dark eyes and bear-like face. But of a sudden, Kenaston felt that that surprise was completely assumed, that in this offhand, casual way, Gorhal was springing something on them and watching for their reaction. "Didn't Piers tell you?" said Gorhal. "No, I suppose he'd have instructions not to. They'd figure you people were emotional primitives like Magro and me, and that the less time you have to think about it, the better." Kenaston said tightly again, "What do you mean by evacuation?" The Capellan looked at him levelly now. "I simply mean that, by order of the governors, all you people are to be evacuated from Earth to some other star world." End of Chapter 11.